Aldous Huxley was an English writer and philosopher. He wrote nearly 50 books. And here's his quote about history. That men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important of all the lessons of history. Welcome to the History Slices podcast, a mother-son duo discussing awesome bits of history. We prove on every show that history is not boring, entertaining, yet stimulating. This is History Slices. And now, here's your hosts, Jacob and Rachel.
All right. Welcome. We're glad you're here. What are we talking about today, Jacob?
Hey, yeah. Yeah, well, today we're talking about a person that I think is really interesting and really fascinating. And I learned a lot researching it that I didn't know about before.
Yeah, I love hearing that.
So that's fun. Have you ever heard, and I'm sure you have you ever heard of Thomas Paine?
Sure. Thomas Paine, Common Sense.
Yes.
There's a hand in hand to me, but honestly, I don't know much more than that, except that Common Sense was written to help influence the people in the colonies to be in favor of the Constitution.
Sure.
Or maybe not the Constitution, but I'm sorry, let me back up, of independence from Britain.
Yes. I think this was a tad earlier than the Constitution was a thing.
Because we got to revolt first.
Yes. So it seems like the right order to do it, honestly. You know, make a country, make a constitution. That sounds about right. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to go through his life. I've skipped over some parts, nothing like too major, of course, but just for the sake of brevity.
Sure.
Because there's a lot about this guy.
I bet.
So he was born February 9th, 1737 in Thetford, which is an English town. His parents were Joseph and Frances Paine. And what's interesting is their last name is spelled P-A-I-N.
Wow, that's so unfortunate.
Is spelled P-A-N-E. He added an E when he moved to America. He changed his name. I don't know. It seems like such a small change to make, but I guess
it does seem like a small change, but it really gives, when you add that E, it sort of takes away the really direct meaning of, like it's not something that's painful. It's just,
I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Also, I misspoke just now. I apologize. He claimed he changed it when he moved to America. There are some records that he used it in England. So he might have changed it a little beforehand.
Okay.
I don't know.
That's interesting.
That's just like an interesting side note. So he went to a grammar school in Thetford from 1744 to 1749. By the time he was 13, he was apprenticed to his dad. His dad was a farmer and a corset maker.
Interesting combo.
Yeah, right. I don't know. I think it might have been one of those things where people might have had multiple professions, I guess.
I bet there were a lot of people who considered themselves farmers too.
That's true.
But so he was probably apprenticed. This is too detailed, but was he apprenticed as a farmer and a corset maker, or just a corset maker?
I think it was a corset maker for reasons we're going to get into.
Okay, that sounds appropriate.
Yeah, they have a specific term for that, by the way, but no one nowadays knows or uses it. So I just went with corset maker because I was just like,
do you know what that term is?
I did. I since forgotten.
Shucks. I like those things like, Cooper, I think is like a barrel maker or something like that. I like this.
How does that? Okay, sure. Whatever. Cool. 1759. But this apprenticeship, it lasted for a few years. And when he was 19, tragically, unfortunately, it didn't last set out on his own to soon after make his own way in life, I guess, which is pretty tragic. Briefly, very briefly.
Did you say 19? I'm sorry, 19.
Couldn't find too much about that.
Did you say 1757?
1759.
Yeah, 1759.
And then he opened up his own corset making shop.
20-something, early 20s. Okay.
Which is an adult at that time.
Yeah.
You can make the argument it's an adult now, but
But this is a history podcast.
Yes. So you know what I mean, though. It's like different perceptions of age groups change over time. This is what it is.
Sure does.
So it was just a rough time altogether for him because it was also around this time that his business collapsed. There's no correlation there or anything like that. I couldn't find out why it collapsed. I'm thinking that maybe it just wasn't as profitable or whatever.
Who knows?
Yeah. There's any number of reasons why stuff goes under.
Sure. But that's terrible to have just to compound that sadness of his wife passing with his business going under.
Yeah. So at this point, he took several different jobs, to kind of hold down. He even had a brief stint as an inspector.
Huh.
Yeah, I think it was like a money related thing, but that didn't last too long though, because he was fired. He allegedly, no idea if this is true or not, but allegedly he claimed to inspect some things he didn't, which it makes me think it was a money thing, because that's usually taken pretty seriously.
True, but it could have been any number of things. If you're inspecting houses and you say,
true.
"Oh yeah, that passes. I inspected it. It's fine," and then something happens,
Yeah.
and it could be really bad to put your name on something that you did it and then you didn't actually. Yeah, that could be really bad.
Regardless,
that doesn't make him look like a very good guy.
Yeah, well,
it's alleged. So.
Well, yeah, well, like, regardless of the situation, it's a serious allegation. So, 1771, March 26, he marries again. A woman named Elizabeth Olive, Ollive. I don't know how you would pronounce that. I think
I would say Olive, even though it seems to have an abundance of L's.
It does, yeah. But names are weird like that. So look at Pablo Picasso's real name sometimes, and you'll see what I mean. But C was the daughter of his landlord, who had recently passed away. Interesting circumstances, I guess. He then entered into the business of Olive's dad's, which is like a grocer and a tobacco maker.
Okay, so he actually passed away, the dad, and Thomas Paine stepped in to his business.
Yeah,
like maybe sort of took it over.
I don't know if he
took it over or if he just
entered that same field or whatever.
I gotcha.
Yeah, grocer and a tobacco maker, basically. Cool. 1772, a year later, he publishes his first political work. Right, because this is what he's known for, his writings.
So this is like the first, like up until now, it's all
just kind of a guy making his way through life. Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
But this is his first thing. It's a 12-page article. It was called "The Case of the Officers of Excise," which is a type of tax for certain goods.
Okay.
Basically, he was arguing for better pay, better working conditions, that type of stuff. Because at that time, that was like, this is before unions were a thing. This is before kind of like
workers. It was easy to take advantage of workers.
Yeah. So he was kind of just argued for like, hey, this is ridiculous. Fix this. kind of. And he apparently was really passionate about it. He spent that winter putting out 4,000 copies. So just
just independently
around. Yeah. Unfortunately, and this is kind of a sad recurrence for some of the people we cover on this. So his tobacco business fell 2 years later. Just bad luck all around. And he ended up having to sell all of his possessions in order to avoid debtor's prison.
Wow. Yeah. Back when they would put people in prison for having debt or for owing money.
And not being
that's interesting. That's really not uncommon, though, for businesses to fail. More fail, I think, than survive.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the things. Like, it's not so much if you take a hit so much as if you get back up after the hit.
Exactly. Yeah.
And to paraphrase Rocky.
It takes a lot of courage to start a business. And I'm sure he probably learned a lot along the way.
I'm sure he learned a bunch of stuff. So
he's down to grocering.
Yeah. 1774, he divorces Elizabeth.
Wow. I honestly didn't think people divorced back then.
Yeah, I don't think they did use. Well, the term I found was formerly separated, but that I don't know what else to call that besides a divorce.
Okay.
I couldn't find a good reason why. It could just been that they weren't getting along.
I mean, we would just have to guess at that point. If
I don't want to speculate too much because I don't know.
Yeah, for whatever reason
Yeah, that was on June 4th. Then he moved to London, which is where he met Benjamin Franklin.
Wow, what a chance meeting!
I know, right? He was actually introduced to him by George Lewis Scott, who was a very famous mathematician at the time, and he was kind of like, he knew Franklin, and I guess he met Paine or knew of Paine because of his writings or whatever. Regardless, it was kind of a meet and greet, so to speak. But yeah, they hit it off. I don't know how that conversation went. I'd be really curious.
That would have been so fun to be a fly on the wall.
Yeah, because those are two very unique individuals. But Benjamin Franklin, he convinced Thomas Paine to immigrate to the American colonies.
Wow.
I guess, more opportunity or whatever, know. He even gave him a letter of recommendation for like his folks back at the colonies, you know, being like, hey, this guy's cool.
Vouching for him.
Yeah, I
wow.
know. So, yeah.
Wow. Can you imagine having a letter of recommendation from Benjamin Franklin?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Well, he wasn't like super, super famous at the time. I mean, he was known, but he wasn't like Benjamin Franklin like we know of him today, you know.
Still.
Yeah. I have things I could say about Benjamin Franklin. That's a whole nother topic.
This is a Thomas Paine episode.
Yes. So Paine, he took that. He's like, okay, sir, I don't really have anything to going for me here.
No kidding.
So I might as well. So on November 30th, 1774, he arrives in Philadelphia. It was a pretty rough voyage there, though. There's bad water supplies. There's a breakout of typhoid fever, which killed like 5 of the people on the boat.
Oh, my goodness.
Sip, I guess. The whole trip took like weeks to get from like London to Philadelphia. And by the time I actually got there, he was so sick he couldn't get off the boat.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, luckily, like the one time he's lucky so far, Ben Franklin's physician was there to welcome him, like in the harbor.
Wow.
Because obviously Franklin's like, hey, this guy's cool.
Yeah.
And so his physician,
he's going to connect him on the other end to be.
But his physician was there, so he was able to help him off the boat and take care of him and kind of nurse him back.
That
to
is
health.
Such an incredible stroke of luck. Huh?
I know, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
So the doctor helped him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It took 6 weeks for him to recover.
My gosh.
So yeah, it's like he must have been like super ill.
Wow. So from the point of leaving London to being on his feet again in the colonies is a couple months.
Yeah. I mean, life was rougher back then, I suppose.
For sure.
Still,
yeah.
geez.
But thank God he had a place to be cared for and to recover, because if that hadn't been the case, he probably would have just died somewhere.
There's actually, we're going to get to it, but there's actually several moments in his life that he has had a near-death experience, just as a kind of a spoiler, I guess.
Wow.
Or not a spoiler, but a tease,
wow.
I suppose. So by March 1775, Thomas Paine, he's kind of integrating himself into Pennsylvania, into kind of the life there. He gets a position as the editor for Philadelphia Magazine, which was just starting up at the time.
Okay. It's called Philadelphia Magazine?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It was one of the first successful publications in the colonies, because they got a lot of stuff from Britain, you know, and there have been a couple times before this to try up their own thing, and they didn't really work for whatever reason, probably a number of reasons. But this one was like the first one that was like, or one of the first ones. There might have been one before, but it was one of the earlier ones that was like actually like a hit.
Cool. And so he just the timing was really serendipitous for him to be there.
I think he like impressed like the guy running it or something from his just how he edited it or whatever. But because Paine was like tied to it, the magazine's success was his success, basically, you know.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And it became like more widely read. The founder of the magazine, Robert Aitken, I'm not sorry I say his name. I'm sorry. Aitken. Robert.
Atkin, maybe even? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, Robert Aitken, he originally wanted the magazine to be apolitical, as in not about that. But Thomas Paine was super political.
How fascinating, though, it was Philadelphia, right, where this was published?
Yes.
And not have anything to do with politics? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's like the hotbed of political thought at the time.
Well, I'm sure there's probably other stuff going on at the time, but
like farming and city building, I guess. And, but how fascinating! Law and order, maybe. Yeah. Wow, that's really incredible.
Yeah. Well, so what Thomas Paine did as like the editor and kind of like as in his position with this magazine is he had a lot of political stuff in it, and the magazine became more political, which was kind of against the wishes of its founder, but what are you gonna do? That's the thing. It was like when you make something, this happened to Ayn Rand also, we mentioned in like a previous episode, is you make something and it sometimes just goes off in its own direction. It gets
a life of its own.
Yeah, and you can't really like, okay, I guess that's
he probably wasn't complaining too much when the papers were selling.
Yeah, I'm sure it was like money talks, you know.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting kind of quotation that I thought was relevant. In the very first issue for this, Paine wrote that, this is the quote, "Every heart and hand seem to be engaged in the interesting struggle for American liberty."
That is interesting. In the very first edition.
Yeah. And this was in 1775, keep in mind. So this is before like a lot of the revolutionary thoughts and stuff kind of start creep up. It was a really interesting thought because I'm like, that says a bit about him as a person.
Yeah, he was really tapped into the pulse of what was going on in the people, in the hearts of the people, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Well, not all the people, of course, but the people who wanted independence.
Or at the very least had strong opinions that ended up becoming popular. No, I know he's not the reason for, or the only reason for that, but yeah, we're going to see in a moment when we get into Common Sense, his writing style and how, at least to say it's accessible. That's all I'm going to say for right now. So while he's in this position with this magazine, he began arguing for using it to become, and I'm another quote here, nursery of genius, which is his words. I don't know what exactly meant like that, but he wanted to become like, he want people in the colonies to, which he also called a nation at this point as well, to kind of think, you know, and kind of be more, I guess, educated or more informed. There is also around this time an anonymous article published in the magazine that gave really scathing criticism of slavery, like super abolitionist, early abolitionist too. Like this was kind of before that took off. It was called African Slavery in America. And we have a lot of reasons to connect that to Paine.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it was anonymous, so we don't know.
Yeah, but he was the editor, so he would at least have known who wrote it if it wasn't himself.
Yeah, and I think there is, and he probably approved of it.
Yeah, that's true.
But like, also, I think he has a very distinct writing style, and that might have also like to add
kind of hard to hide your voice when you're writing.
That. Yeah. He also talked a lot about like worker rights and stuff. He was very progressive for his time. I want to, when we're done going through his life, I want to talk about some of the things that he was way ahead of his time on.
Interesting,
because it's so fascinating and interesting to me. So pretty opinionated, pretty progressive for the time. When the revolution started to break out, you know, when like the Boston Tea Party and like the Boston Massacre or whatever, you know, all this stuff was happening. He was there, of course, in Philadelphia. He published Common Sense, which was January 10th, 1776. Okay. So this is like his most famous work. Like you yourself, when I asked you at the beginning of this episode, you're like, yeah, Thomas Paine and Common Sense. Like that's what you knew about him. It's 47 pages long. It's a pamphlet. And it's basically is advocating for independence from Great Britain.
That's a lot of pages to do that. Have you read Common Sense?
No, I've read bits of it like back in college, but it's been a long time. I don't remember a lot of it. Well, at this time, keep in mind, the revolution is just kind of starting, and most people were generally not as into the idea of independence. They weren't really throwing on the I word, if you know what I mean. It was more of well, let's try to reconcile with Great Britain. Let's try to figure out our differences, you know, because it was a lot of the beef people had was that we're being taxed so heavily, and we don't have, where before we had a lot of freedom and not a lot of oversight, and we don't have any representation in Parliament, so it's not like we have a say in this.
Right. And if I could interject, I think it's kind of human tendency to just sort of sit back and watch and let's see what happens. Let's see what's going to happen. You know, if this is going to reconcile itself or what. But it's for such a dramatic move, like deliberately break off from England, that must have, you know, taken, people had to pay attention really and make a decision.
Yes.
And so he was probably trying to push them to do that.
Yeah, well, that was the case until Paine exploded on the scene and became a household name. Because at this point, he was just like, oh, yeah, he's like the magazine guy.
Yeah.
You know, but now he was like, everyone knew about Thomas Paine, or they knew about Common Sense that was written by Thomas Paine. He got a lot of people on board with the idea. He used a lot of like moral arguments about like, this is why monarchy sucks. And also like political kind of stances and arguments as to like, this doesn't make sense or whatever. He also, this is interesting, he also proposed a form of the Constitution before it was a thing.
Wow. In like 1776?
Yeah, I looked at it. It's a bit confusing.
I'm sure. The language was probably...
that, and it was like... there's a chart I found that had like basically these people vote for these people who vote for these people who elect these people. It was like a whole thing, you know what I mean? And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. I don't know if that would work or not, but it was a little too much for me to follow. Maybe I was in the right headspace at the time.
But he was really thinking through everything. He wasn't just throwing out ideas.
Yeah, he wasn't just throwing
not
out
backing
stuff.
them with some extra thought. Interesting.
It's pretty interesting. And it's probably the definition of radical too for the time. Another thing that kind of he not really introduced but popularized is the idea that the king is to blame for their troubles. Because before it was a lot like, well, it's a lot of the ministers and a lot of the government officials and like the hanger-ons of the king, they're the ones that are taxing us so hard, you know. The king is
but still honor the king or whatever,
because that's the theme. It's like, well, we gotta be respectful to king. In King George's presence, you would have to bow 3 times to, like, you know, be in his presence. Like, it was a big kind of respect thing.
Yeah, interesting.
It seems like an annoyance for everyone involved, but sir, whatever. I guess not.
3 times. I wonder why once just wasn't enough.
I don't know. Maybe to make double sure that you're serious. I don't know. But yeah, common sense was like, no, it's the king's fault. He's the one in charge. You know, this stuff is coming from him. Now, when adjusted for the population at the time of the colonies, which was like 2.5 million, give or take, Common Sense is the #1 best-selling American title.
Wow.
When adjusted for population, obviously. Yeah. Nowadays, it's not.
So that's incredible.
Mm-hmm. It's still in print to this day. When it was first published, it sold 100,000 copies in the first 3 months. Wow. So yeah, everyone read this basically. Like, it was in like taverns and bars. People were reading it. It was everywhere. He was like I don't want to say he was like a celebrity because I don't know if that's accurate, but he might as well have been a celebrity.
Yeah, he was well known.
Yeah.
It makes me want to go back and read it.
Yeah. By the time the revolution ended, it had sold 500,000 copies.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And part of what made it so accessible is his writing style. I've talked about this before. He is very direct and very kind of to the point, and he isn't formal or flowery like some other people at the time were, kind of what the generally accepted.
He didn't waste words. He just
kind of straight to the gist of it. Yeah.
Kind of reminds me a little bit, totally different type of writing.
Sure.
Hemingway.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
With the very minimalist, I think. But of course, he was writing fiction.
Yeah.
Or memoirs. And
well, the thing with Hemingway is that he was writing fiction that was heavily based off his own experiences.
Right. And of course, this is completely different. This is about ideas. This
is ideologies, and this is like pushing political thought. And yeah, it is different, but that is an interesting comparison to make.
To use fewer words to say what you mean.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, needless to say, everyone read it. Became talk of the town, so to speak. There was a lot of letters and documentation from the time that we have now that is talking about Common Sense, which is one of the reasons we know it was so significant.
That's really cool to be able to look back and see sort of the footprint and effect of a piece of writing through other writing at the time. That's so cool.
Yeah, because nowadays you can get that with like, oh yeah, if you go on YouTube and go back like 5 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And everyone's talking about a certain movie coming out or what, you know, you're like, oh, okay, this dates this. That was a thing. It was a big because everyone was talking about it. But this is before video. This is before all this stuff. So it's like, it's literally just writings, which is interesting.
It's so cool.
Yeah. The reaction is very interesting. It's very much a mixed bag, as I'm sure you can guess. Some really loved it. They're like fully on board. Others hated it. They're like, no, this is terrible.
This is dangerous, probably.
Yeah. Some liked it, but they disagreed with elements of his argument, you know, which is kind of like, I get where you're coming from and I agree mostly, but there's a couple things I disagree with, you know. It's a mixed bag. It's a whole spectrum, you know. There were a few writings published in response to Common Sense, you know, which is how you know you hit something when people are responding
publicly, right?
Yeah, both by loyalists and revolutionaries, by the way, which is interesting. Plain Truth, which is the title of a thing. I think it was written by like a Marylander or something like that. It called Paine a fraud. It said that without a monarchy, the government would, and this is a direct quote, degenerate into democracy.
Oh my gosh.
So
that's an interesting thing to say and to think about, degenerate into democracy.
Yeah, well, it shows you that like it's hard.
It shows you that democracy wasn't the ideal, obviously, for everybody.
Well, it's hard to look back at history and remove the mindset that you live in and have grown up in and try to put your minds couple centuries in the past, because there's stuff like that where it's like, no, not everyone thought democracy was great in this part of the world. Obviously nowadays there's still like people elsewhere that aren't fans of democracy, but you know what I mean though.
It's so
like,
fascinating. I mean, we are a product of our times.
Yeah. And like they're like, no, monarchy, like divine right of rule and all that, that's the way to go. It's interesting. It's very fascinating. John Adams, future president, of course, he was also very critical of Paine's argument. I get the feeling he was also very opinionated. He wrote Thoughts on Government, basically saying so, basically criticizing him. Part of his disagreement that I found, because I was curious, like, well, what was the specifics?
I was wondering too.
Yeah, he didn't like. Oh, so Paine argued that men that don't own property should still be able to vote and hold office. And John Adams disagreed with him and thought, no, you should own property in order to participate in government and voting and stuff.
Oh, what a good discussion that would be, huh?
So especially at the time, because now it's a little different.
Yeah, because who were the landowners? Who didn't own land?
Mm-hmm.
What did owning land signify about who you were? Yeah. You know, and if you didn't, who you were.
Sure.
Yeah. Very fascinating.
But that's just like a point of contention between those two.
So cool.
Mm-hmm. I also really love the title, Common Sense. Yeah. It sounds very snarky. It wasn't meant to be snarky or sarcastic.
It was meant to be just like...
don't understand what I'm saying.
Very straightforward, just common sense.
Yeah. I think it had like another title initially, but it got changed to a better one.
Oh, it's really a great title.
It is, yeah. It's real catchy too. So later that year, 1776, Paine begins a series of pamphlets, which he calls the American Crisis, which is basically propaganda designed to motivate and inspire Americans during the war. George Washington, this is a fun little fact, George Washington had the pamphlets read to his troops to kind of like motivate them and inspire morale and stuff, which is interesting.
Yeah,
There's
that
like
is interesting.
A dozen of them or so.
I can see the importance of having stuff like that. And propaganda to me always feels like such a negative word, but you do have to have your troops on the same page, like to make sure everybody knows, okay, this is what we're fighting for. And that's fascinating.
Yeah, no, I understand the negative connotations with the word propaganda. I totally get that, because you're right. It is, very kind of one of those questionable things. Yeah. But literally every country at war does that. Yeah. And I think it makes sense why they do that. I'm not saying it's good or bad, because I don't know, but it's interesting. Mm-hmm. Regardless, these are clearly propaganda. like putting on that whole debate aside, that's what they were. So 1777, he had become the secretary of the Congressional Committee on Foreign Affairs, which didn't last long. He got caught up in a scandal because basically what happened was the colonies were talking with France in order to get France's support, because France was not a fan of Britain, and they thought, hey, if we can get their support to help, that would be a great boon to us. And that's what they were doing. Paine let on that they were talking to France, which they wasn't supposed to do.
He let on to who?
Just I think in public or whatever. Oh. And it cost him his job. I don't think he was like trying to screw up anything. I think he just talks. Yeah, I just think he's not gonna keeping stuff inside. Yeah.
So he lost his job. Oh gosh.
Yeah, which sucks, but it's like, well, yeah, that's fair. But that happened 1779, so he was in this position for a couple years. He actually, during the Revolution, made a bunch of trips to France. He got like a lot of support and money and whatnot. And he went on missions with John Lawrence, who I don't know if you remember that Hamilton musical.
Of course,
a few years back.
John Lawrence.
Yeah. So after the Revolution, he's pretty well known. He's got like a lot of support. A lot of people like him. A lot of people don't like him. But he's like a known person. The founding fathers, they're all aware of him. I think, I don't know if he's considered one or not, but he's definitely a influential, noted person that was active at this time. Right. So afterwards, after the American Revolution, the French Revolution began, and that's a totally different animal. And I can have like a whole episode, multiple episodes on the French Revolution. But basically, in a nutshell, the French Revolution was inspired by the American Revolution, at least in part, because people were really fed up and ticked off at their king. For good reasons, because he was incompetent and didn't know what he was doing, but that's a whole nother thing. They're like in the worst financial crisis like centuries. It was like it was bad. But unlike the American Revolution, the French Revolution turned a lot more violent and a lot more bloody, and they had change of power several times with like basically tyrannical regimes with the Reign of Terror and stuff. It was a whole thing. It kind of, in a bigger scope of history, the French Revolution is where Napoleon Bonaparte kind of first rose to prominence. And it's kind of his origin, if you will. That's a whole nother thing. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because Paine was super into the French Revolution when it started. Same with Thomas Jefferson also. They were like, hey, we should help them. They're fighting the same fight we were fighting, even though it was the circumstances were a bit different. But
a lot of the ideals were the same.
Yeah, at least initially. A lot of the ideas were the same. And like the, sorry, I was just thinking about that Hamilton musical where it's like, the people are leading, the people are rioting, like that's the difference, Regardless, Paine went there to France in 1790 in order to like partake in the revolution and to kind of like try to help them out. Now, Edmund Burke, who was a writer that was against the French Revolution, he did not like it.
He was an American writer?
He was Irish.
Okay.
He wrote I don't know if you call it like a book or a pamphlet or whatever, a text called Reflections on the Revolution in France. No question as to what that's about. It sold 30,000 copies.
Okay. That sounds like something that would be post-revolution, written post-revolution, right? Or no?
No,
not necessarily.
This is during the French Revolution.
Okay.
Paine responded because he's for the revolution and Burke was against it. So he wrote Rights of Man, which was 90,000 words of him just bashing monarchies, bashing conservatism, not today's conservatism. I mean like conservatism of that day, which was like divine rule, monarchism, all that jazz. Things that have been that way for centuries.
Right.
And with the Enlightenment has been kind of been shaken up, basically. He had trouble getting Rights of Man published in France. The authorities in France at the time were against it. And so, it's like, well, you can't go against what the powers that be says. Eventually, he found a publisher. It hit the streets March 13th, 1791, and it sold nearly 1 million copies.
Oh, my gosh.
A lot of people read it. I don't know how well known he was in France. Like, I don't know how much clout he had.
It sold 1 million copies in France?
Yeah. Wow. I believe, yes. Or nearly 1 million.
Yeah.
So, next year, kind of piggybacking off that success, he writes a follow-up text. Now, at this point in France, he was causing a massive stir. Like people were like, they're for it, they're against it. There's violence in the streets because of everything else going on. There's no food to eat, all that stuff. There were several groups that formed that wanted reform, kind of around these Paine's kind of ideas that he's been throwing out there. He got a lot of accusations for being a rabble rouser.
I can see why it would be dangerous to be him.
He ended up getting arrested December 28th, 1793, for like basically going not against the grain, but against the people who were in charge at the time.
And basically causing problems.
Yes, he was causing problems. There were some Americans in Paris at the time, and they pleaded for Paine's release because they're like, no, he's cool, But the French authorities didn't recognize his American citizenship. They claimed he was an Englishman.
Oh.
Keep in mind, France and Britain were at war at this time, too. France was at war with like a lot of people, by the way, because a lot of the monarchies nearby were not happy with them chopping off their king's head.
Oh, my gosh.
So that's like a whole nother thing. But needless to say, they wouldn't use that that defense. This is where he nearly died. I mentioned a couple times before that. Like he's had a few brushes with death. This is one of them. The only reason he survived is the jailer that he was kept at made a mistake. There's supposed to be like a note put on like his door that was like, hey, this guy is scheduled for execution.
Oh my gosh.
And he ended up not doing that or put it on the wrong side or whatever. The jailer messed up and he managed to survive a few days just long enough for Robespierre to fall from power.
Wow.
And on July 27, 1794. And when the government changed hands again, he got released because they're like, okay.
That's so incredible. Oh my gosh.
Just like it's so fascinating because he's had such terrible luck in his life, but also just these moments of like absolute just the heavens open.
Miracles almost, like for that to be arranged. Just so like, this is craziness. Yeah, I love it.
So in 1802 or 1803, we're not entirely sure, he returns to the United States. Though his reputation, which was what's really high, is now really low. A lot of people on both sides of the aisles have problems with him now. He made a text, I think he called it The Aids of Reason. Something, I don't know why I don't have it written down, but he was very much an outspoken critic of Christianity, or at least in that he, not so much religion. He was actually for like freedom of religion, but like there was, from what I read, he had like some real serious reservations about certain claims the Bible made, stuff like that,
I can see how that would cause
controversy.
Yes.
Yeah, especially at that time where people were generally more religious.
Yeah.
He also there's also this general disagreement with his political stances, if it's just still going on, because that's the thing with anyone who's involved in politics sometimes gets to a point where it's like you agree with them or you don't.
Yeah.
And in like a very divided situation, so to speak, it turns into you either love him or you hate him. So there's also that going on top of him kind of being, not anti-Christian, but like having criticisms about that stuff.
He definitely wasn't a neutral kind of person.
No, he was very he's reminds me a bit of Andrew Jackson a little, not so much in his personality or stances or even his temperament, but just in terms of like he had opinions, wasn't afraid to say them, didn't really care what people thought of it. That's kind of the vibe I got, which honestly I respect, because at least you know where they stand.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's good to know that about people.
Yeah. He was also very critical of George Washington, who was insanely popular at the time. Like the first couple elections in our country was not really elections. It was just people saying, George, we want you to be president. He's like, okay. And like Noah ran against him because everyone loved George Washington. And he was critical of some of his decisions and policies or whatever. So he basically managed to alienate everyone, which is kind of impressive.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's interesting how definitively the tables turned on him. He was loved and respected when he went to France, and he comes back and people just don't like him anymore.
Yeah. Well, it's times change and opinions change. And when he was 72, June 8th, 1809, he's 72, he passes away,
Not bad. That's not a bad age
no,
at that
it
time.
Isn't. That's respectable. Only 6 people came to his funeral.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. And I think like his obituary or whatever, he said, I see if I can, I don't have it written down, but is a really interesting quote about him at the time, where it was like, he lived a long life, he did some good and much harm, or something like that.
Wow.
Like the people did not like him.
Yeah. So the scale definitely weighed more for harm than good. That's
at least as
that's
far
really
as
incredible.
that person was
as far as whoever wrote that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. And at the time, maybe that's what they thought, and maybe that is true. Who knows? But
nowadays he's way more popular. People have a much more, I don't know if nuance is the right word, positive at least, impression of him. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about some of the things he advocated for, and I want to show how he was so ahead of his time and very progressive. And he was very much like, he wouldn't be out of place later on in history with some of these ideas.
Yeah.
So first of all, he argued that government should serve its citizens. That's a no-brainer. But it's like, at the time, that was also a bit of a radical idea, because this is still like a time when there's the idea of like the people should serve their nation or their
leaders
country. He argued that slavery was evil, also a no-brainer. But this was before this is decades before like the Civil War he passed away decades before the Civil War, and the whole abolitionist movement really picked up speed. He argued for freedom of religion. He argued for like being respectful to Native Americans. He opposed the death penalty, which is debated nowadays. Is also was one of the reasons he was in hot water in France, also because they were just cutting people's heads off left, right, and center. And he was like, no, thank you. I think that's what we're on. He was against cruelty to animals. At the time, people thought animals were kind of just like brain dead, like just things. They didn't really think of them as like being able to like feel like pain or fear or whatever, which obviously they can. He supported women's rights at a time when they couldn't vote, much less couldn't even like pray in public, like a lot of restrictions on women, and he was very much for, women's rights. Tons of stuff that like nowadays, a lot of stuff that now is like, well, yeah, obviously that's all fine and dandy. I'll see what the controversy
because society sort of evolved from how it was.
It shows a lot how far we've come as not just a society, but as a species, that a lot of stuff is like just kind of, yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah.
But he had to like argue for it because it wasn't always like that.
Yeah. That's really fascinating.
He had his flaws. He definitely has flaws. He drank a lot. He, probably could use a little more tact sometimes. And I get the impression he might not have. He was either the best person to be around or the worst person to be around, just kind of given how outspoken he was and stuff.
Yeah, it seems like he could rub people the wrong way.
Oh,
definitely.
But it's hardly to wonder why nowadays people look back at him and be like, oh, this guy's actually pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I admire him, honestly. I think he's like just a really fascinating figure in history, both in terms of like where he was and what he advocated for, I suppose. And also just the personality that like, I mean, I never knew him, of course, but from researching him, his character and his accents and stuff like that, which speaks to who he was as a person.
Yeah.
Very interesting as well.
It's so cool. And he was the same person no matter what the backdrop was, whether
That's
he was
true.
in the US or in France.
Or in London.
Yeah, he was always who he was.
Yeah, he was cool. Like a consistent person.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's interesting. So I want to kind of talk about him because I get the feeling that, well, people know his name. They don't necessarily know as much about him as.
Well, I sure learned a lot this time around. That's awesome. Thank you so much. Now, a couple quick questions.
Of course, yeah.
After his second wife, the divorce of his second wife, did he marry again?
I don't believe so. He might have. I didn't find anything about that.
And it doesn't come up, and so maybe he didn't. And children? No children?
He had a stillborn kid, unfortunately. And that was when the wife passed.
Wow, so they both passed away.
Yeah.
Oh, how tragic that must have been.
Yeah, but I don't think he had any, as far as we know. Like, it's a thing where it's like he might have had like a one night thing or something that we don't know
illegitimate
about.
Kid somewhere.
Yeah, which happens, but we don't know for sure. Yeah, so I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say probably not.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Awesome job. I loved it. I loved hearing about Thomas Paine. I love that time of history, and there's a lot I don't know about it.
It's a very fascinating time, and I think it's in a big scope of history, which obviously is hard to look at because there's a lot, but I think it's very impactful for what is one of those, not choke points, but it's one of those events or time periods in history that ends up affecting pretty much everything after it.
Yeah, that's very cool. I hope we do some more episodes around this time period because it starts to chip away at the big picture and fill it in and start to understand multiple aspects of it. It's very cool.
Sure.
Nice job. So, what's happening next week?
Do you know who Timothy Leary is?
Does he sell insurance?
No,
no, I don't know.
He might as well have. So we're gonna have a real fascinating time next week. Okay, let me tease it a bit.
Okay.
So we're going to the 1960s.
Oh, the 1960s.
Specifically,
it's not that far in the past.
No, but specifically the counterculture hippie drug movement of the 1960s.
Oh, very cool.
Which is a very fascinating time for me, at least.
Oh, that's so interesting. I have not ever heard you talk about that quote unquote era. So that'll be cool to hear what you have to say about that.
So next week we'll be talking about that. And the week after that, I promise we'll do something that isn't a person. I know it's been like person. I don't want to turn it to like a bunch, like making much of biographies here,
That's cool though. People are interesting.
Yeah. Well,
good deal. Well, thank you so much, Jacob. Listeners, thank you so much for being with us. We're glad you're there. Please tune in next time.
Bye.
Confucius once said, "Study the past if you would define the future." You've been listening to the History Slices podcast with Jacob and Rachel. We hope you've gotten some useful information from the show. We hope we made you think, and we hope you were entertained. We know we had fun, and we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hook up with us on Facebook at History Slices and on Instagram at History Slices Podcast. Make sure to like, rate, and review the show, and tell a friend about the show. That'll help us out too. One more quote before we go from Michael Crichton. If you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it's part of a tree. Till next time, this is History Slices, signing off.